Ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to be kicking off the Best Virginian 2024 Summer Reading Program by talking about one of my favorite stories, The Music of Erich Zann by H.P. Lovecraft. Last week I released an audiobook version of this story. If you haven't checked it out yet or you're not familiar with the story, I'll put it down in the description below and I'll put a link to it up here. Check it out, it's about 20 minutes long. So The Music of Erich Zann is a very important story for me because it was the story that got me back into ghost stories, folklore, and horror. At some point in my teen years, I lost interest in folklore and the paranormal, but in my early 20s, a friend of mine had gotten really into the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And this friend of mine let me borrow one of his collections of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, and at the time I wasn't really familiar with the author. I knew him primarily as the giant fish monster guy. I also knew Lovecraftian as an adjective, kind of being synonymous with like cosmic horror, but I had never read any of the works by the actual author. As I was reading through this collection of short stories, I think The Music of Erich Zann was the third or fourth story in this book, and I read the first couple, and it really didn't click. I really didn't get it. They weren't the big cosmic horror stories like I'd been expecting, but after reading a couple of them, I came across The Music of Erich Zann, and as soon as I finished reading it, it just clicked. I understood why many regard H.P. Lovecraft as a master of psychological horror. And I understand there are many reasons people do not like H.P. Lovecraft as a person or an author. To put it quite bluntly, if the guy would have been born in 1990 instead of 1890, he never would have become an author because he would have been too busy being a full-time troll on internet anime forums. But it's impossible to deny the impact him and his works have had on the world of pop culture. His works not just influenced generations of authors, but also filmmakers, musicians, artists, and video game designers. Probably the most famous of these would be John Carpenter's The Thing, and really any of the major 1980s into early 1990s, kind of the golden age of body horror in films and horror. Arkham, a fictional city in Massachusetts, has become synonymous with the Batman and DC universe, along with musicians like Metallica, who have personally done 3 or 4 songs directly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. So with that, let's get right into the work. Let's talk about The Music of Erich Zann. I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue d'Iselle. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place. So the story begins with an unnamed protagonist telling us that he is unable to find the street that he lived on when he was in college. He's looked at maps both old and new, and he's unable to find it. It's like the street that he called home never even existed. Which, that is terrifying on such a primal level. Like, there's only 3 explanations that could cause something like this. Either 1, his mental health is in such a decline that entire sections of memories, entire series of events in his life, he's remembering wrong. Another option is that something happened to him so traumatic that he forced those memories out of his mind, and over time, he has just filled in that gap with these memories of the street he lived on. Think BioShock Infinite. That really kind of deals with what option 2 is. And option 3 is something paranormal and horrifying happened that caused this neighborhood he lived in to just disappear from time and space. And that's the least terrifying option. Do you know how bad the situation has to be for the horrific paranormal option to be the least terrifying option? And this is all within the first couple of paragraphs of the story. Like, this is a brilliant setup for an amazing story. He then goes on to describe the buildings on the street, his landlord, his neighbors, and the music he heard on the first night he moved into this apartment.
The Rue DSL lay across a dark river, bordered by precipitous brick, Blair-windowed warehouses, and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if the smoke of neighboring factories shut down the sun perpetually.
Imagine if you were talking to some friends that you went to school with, and you started talking to them about this field trip to a museum you went on in middle school, and none of them remember it. You go to look up the museum, and it doesn't exist. It never existed. You vividly remember getting a group picture taken with them, that picture being developed and hanging on your mom's refrigerator for 10 years, but it never existed. You never went on the trip. The museum never even existed. That would be horrifying, and yet this is a situation that our unnamed protagonist finds themselves in. Now we find out that the music is being played by a mute viol player named Erich Zann. Zann plays with a theater orchestra, and a viol is like a weird crossover between a cello and like a lute or guitar. I looked up and listened to some viol music, and I probably wouldn't be able to tell it apart from like a cello. It basically just sounds like a lower, bassier violin in my opinion, and I'm not gonna try going into super detail about it. Like, I'm tone deaf and musically declined, and I'm already working way above my pay grade talking about literature. I'm not going to get into like instrument theory or music composition. Like, I'm already completely out of my league here.
Thereafter, I heard Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance.
And every night after that, the protagonist stays awake listening to the playing of Erich Zann. And he loves the music, but there's something about it he can't quite put his finger on. He realizes that Erich Zann has to be a genius, excellent player and composer, because as he's listening to it, there's these weird notes that, one, he can't imagine the viol making, but two, he can't imagine only one person playing this music. He assumes there has to be multiple musicians taking part in it. And this leads to an obsession that the protagonist has for the entirety of the rest of the story. And this part reminded me like the setup of a lot of other music-related stories. You've probably heard stories in the past about, a kid that starts out as a dishwasher in a jazz club and then just becomes enthralled with the music and culture, or a rock and roll musician that, the first music they hear is some old timers playing the blues on a dusty front porch, and they're just enthralled with music for the rest of their life. Or, a guy hears a Beatles song and it just speaks to him and it changes the entire trajectory of the rest of their life. The Charles Manson approach to music, if you will. And this obsession just keeps building and building until finally he meets Erich Zann himself, and he asks him if he can set in on one of his playing sessions. And Zann plays a beautiful arrangement for him, but it kind of annoys the main character because it doesn't feature any of the weirdness. It doesn't feature any of those strange notes that he spent many a night obsessing over. And when he tries mimicking some of these sounds to Erich Zann, Zann goes nuts.
For a moment, I was inclined to use persuasion regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation.
Eventually, Zann calms down a little bit, and he explains he has to write it out. Again, he's mute, but he's also a native German living in France that doesn't have the greatest grasp on the language, but he writes out kind of in broken French that he has some mental health issues. He can't stand having other people in his apartment, and the music that he plays, he hates for other people to imitate it. And this is how he kind of tries to push away the protagonist of the story. But it doesn't stop the protagonist. This obsession continues. And in fact, as the protagonist goes to leave, him and Zane both hear a sound from outside the window that causes them both to jump. And this just adds to the obsession. At first, he was just obsessed with hearing Erich Zann play, but now he's obsessed with seeing what's outside that window. Zann lives on the highest floor of this apartment building. This apartment building sits on the highest point of this hill in this neighborhood, the Rue d'Isle, and it's the only window. There's this big wall that kind of runs parallel to the street, and it's the only window that can overlook this wall. Surely will provide a very unique view to overlook the city down below. So the protagonist, he becomes obsessed with the music and seeing what's outside this window. So after this conversation, Zann insists that the protagonist move to a lower floor. I think Zann lived on the 5th floor, maybe the 6th, and the protagonist lived on either the 5th or the 4th floor. He moves down to, I think, the 3rd floor. And there was no one left in between them, so he can no longer hear the music of Erich Zann at night. And he mentions he lived in between an aged moneylender and a respected upholsterer. Again, he lived in a neighborhood that was full of life, full of people, and none of it exists anymore. And he's unable to find any evidence of it, that it ever existed. And one little note all the way back at the beginning is he talked about how there was a river. He had to cross a bridge to go from the main part of the city to this neighborhood, and how foul this river smelled. So he would just walk around the streets hoping that one day he would get a whiff of the stinky, nasty river, and he would know that he was close. And that is a nice little detail, because there are certain things that I will occasionally smell that just will pull me right back to my childhood. Like the last 30 years of my life will just disappear, and I'll remember like the smell of peanut butter in my elementary school cafeteria. That's such a great little detail in this story. I love it so much.
At first I would tiptoe up to my old 5th floor. Then I grew bold enough to climb that last creaking staircase to the peak garage. There, in the narrow hall outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread. The dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but they held vibration, suggesting nothing on this globe of Earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly, Erich Zann was a genius of wild power.
So our protagonist, even though he's moved down to this lower floor and Zann is paying the difference between his original rent and the rent for this better room, he still at night will go up to the old floor, and he gets to the point where he's actually hanging out outside of Zann's apartment listening to him play. You can kind of see the descent into madness. At one point, he actually tries entering Zann's apartment while Zann is out playing at the theater, because again, he wants to see what's outside this big window. As time goes on, Zann's playing just keeps getting wilder and wilder and more chaotic at night, and at the same time, our main character mentions that Zann's appearance just keeps getting more and more haggard and more sickly. And eventually it all reaches a climax when one night the protagonist is outside of Erich Zann's door, and Zann is just furiously playing, and he lets out the scream, and our main character hears him fall to the floor. He quickly starts shaking the door, trying to get the attention of Zann, letting him know that he's there. Zann eventually pulls himself up. He hears Zann close the window, and he makes his way over, opens up the door, and runs out, grabbing our main character like a child grabbing their mother's skirt, which is such a good line. There's so much information in that little sentence there. It's beautiful. I love it so much.
Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was, while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew.
And Zann agrees to start writing and explain everything that's going on to the main character. And this is a very important point in this story. That is the scope of the story. And if you don't know what scope is, it's a literary term, basically making sure the story is told from the right and best point of view. Because this isn't the protagonist's story at all. This is the story of Erich Zann, right? Our protagonist has no idea what's going on. He knows nothing about the music. He knows nothing about the window or what's beyond it. He's just a bystander in Erich Zann's story. So Zann starts writing out everything when all of a sudden he hears from far out the window somewhere music notes start playing, and Zann runs over, picks up his viol, and starts furiously playing back. We don't know what's going on here. This is some like dueling banjos, Devil Went Down to Georgia. This is a music battle between Erich Zann and the unknown, right? Between Erich Zann and just the chaos of the cosmos. And as the playing gets more and more intense, the wind outside gets more and more violent until it flings open the window, shatters the glass, the candles in the room go out, everything's drenched in blackness. The notes trying to explain what was going on get blown all over the place, get blown towards the window, and of course our protagonist, he wants to know what's going on, right? We want to know what's going on. This story has just built up and up and up. There's been more and more conflict. There's zero resolution. We have to know what's going on. And as the notes fly out the window and the protagonist goes to try and grab any scrap of information they can, they look down at what should be an entire city down below them, right? And there's nothing.
It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from the highest of all the gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, and no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable. Unimagined space alive with motion and music, and having no semblance to anything on earth.
There's just a black void of nothingness. Where's this music coming from? We don't know. It could be coming from the deepest, darkest points of the cosmos, because there is nothing down below. And that's when the protagonist realizes he has to flee, and he has to at least try to take Zann with him. But once he reaches back and finds Zann, Zann is just completely entranced, completely cold, not moving. Or I think he's still playing, but like he's just completely entranced and unable to move. And with that, our protagonist just runs as quickly as he can away from this neighborhood, down this hill, across the bridge, across the stinky river. And that's when we're given probably one of the most terrifying notes in this entire story.
Clattering down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets and the putrid canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights in the city twinkled.
There was a massive storm going on up on this hill, right? The wind was blowing so violently, it was breaking windows. And he crosses the bridge, and it's just a still, normal, calm night. There's lights out, there's not a cloud in the sky, and that's where the story ends. There's absolutely no resolution. We learn nothing from this story, right? This is a probably 5 or 6 page story, and we end it knowing just as little as we did when we started it. And that is why, in my opinion, this is probably one of the best psychological horror stories ever told. So that was the music of Erich Zann. What are your thoughts on it? What are your thoughts on H.P. Lovecraft as an author and a person? And what other stories would you like to see me cover in the summer reading program? I think next week I'm going to do an additional video on my ghosts from folklore and literature, and then after that we will get right back into it with another amazing horror story. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to talk to you again very, very soon.